Yeah, so that is Acadia National
Yeah,
Park.
they used to say,
Yeah.
did they ever say as Maine goes?
That's
the arm of the chair.
As Maine goes, so goes the nation.
There you go.
Yep. So-
Perfect.
Okay, well, we're going to Maine today. And you'll be in Acadia National Park in a couple of minutes. My name is Evan Wiener, and this is an old cruise ship talk that I do when I was on cruise ships before COVID. And every fall, we would end up in Boston and Portland and Bar Harbor before going up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton, and Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Quebec City. Okay? Okay, so
Where Halifax?
Halifax as well.
That's where my brother went to medical school.
Oh, Halifax, okay.
Dalhousie.
Dalhousie, I was going to tell you that.
May he rest in
yeah.
peace.
Anyway, so this is an old cruise ship talk, and I used to do Boston and Maine, and I was, about a month ago, I was just playing around. I had a day off, so I could write these things in 3 hours. So I said, oh, let me take a look at what this looked like at one point. So yeah, I could fill it out. Remember Maine? Know the state. The present day Maine started off as a province of Massachusetts in 1677, and that's important later on in American history, about 150 years later. On March 15th, 1820, Maine officially broke up with the Bay State, Massachusetts. It became a state on its own and no longer part of Massachusetts. The people who were living in the North Massachusetts colony, which was North Massachusetts, said, we just don't like those people down in Boston, and they don't like us. So why don't we just break away? But it's not as simple as you think it was that we could leave Massachusetts. When you're in Maine, you get to see a lot of that. A lot of the coastline, a lot of trees, forest, cold weather, and not bad in the summer. Mainers began campaigning for statehood in the years following the American Revolution. Maine was a district of Massachusetts, but had only about 10,000 people there, and they were all in the southern coastal ports, and they identified with those people down in Boston with shipping and trade interests. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, how many of you remember 5th grade? 5th grade, you learned this in 5th grade. As Maine struggled to free itself of Massachusetts, the question of statehood suddenly and unexpectedly became entangled with the thorny issue of slavery. The people of Maine, or Massachusetts at that point, were strong abolitionists who found themselves in the odd position of opposing the very bill that would give them what they had sought for so long, a state. Maine, of course, was involved with the American Revolution and about 6 or 7 other wars as well, which started in the 17th century in North America because England and France had all these disputes, as did Spain and other countries. When Maine became a state in 1820, its constitution was very progressive for its time. State leaders included protections for religious freedom, eliminated property tax as a precondition to vote. Back when America was formed, the only people who were allowed to vote were landowners. If you had money, you could vote. If you were a peasant, you couldn't vote. And they also granted black men the right to vote. But notice they did not grant women the right to vote. You know, in the 19th century, if you were a male in an insane asylum, you had more rights than a woman in the United States. They held you higher in the insane asylum if you were a man than you were a woman. The legislation submitted its petition for statehood to the U.S. Congress December 1819, but its bid played into a political context that extended far beyond New England. Maine became the Union's 23rd state as part of the Missouri Compromise, which aimed to maintain the balance of free states and slave states in the country. So Maine is admitted as a free state, and Missouri joins as a slave state. And the Missouri Compromise also banned slavery in the Louisiana Territory. There weren't all states there at that point, which meant Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and a whole bunch of other states north of the 3630 latitude line. This is why people go to Maine. get you a little sailboat there, and you could have a really good time, and you could eat some lobster in Maine as well. Maine is known for its summer homes, for the elite of society, and its rugged coastline. Maine's a product of the Ice Age, the last glacier responsible for cutting what had been a relatively straight coastline into hundreds of bays, inlets, and picturesque harbors as we know today. The receding ice sheet formed about 2,000 or so islands off the Maine coast. Probably Bar Harbor is the most famous of the islands. Discovery, there is Bar Harbor behind me there, and colonialization. About 500 years before Columbus discovered America, did Columbus discover America? He wasn't even on the mainland. You know, he never visited the mainland. He was never in New York. He was never in Columbus, Ohio. He was never in Columbus, Georgia. Or Columbus, where's that, Iowa. He was never there. He was never in any of those places. But they named all those towns after Columbus, even though he was only in the Caribbean. Anyway, about 500 years before Columbus discovered America, Leif Erikson and a crew of about 30 Viking sailors are believed to have explored the Maine coast and may have landed there and tried to establish a settlement. They did land up in Newfoundland, Labrador. There are some ruins that in the Newfoundland part of that area. There are some ruins that show that the Vikings were there around the year 1000. The first settlement was by the Plymouth Company in Popham in 1607. But you've never heard of them, have you? You've heard of the Jamestown colony, right? You didn't hear about these people because, you know, victors write history, right? And they didn't survive. They didn't realize that Maine had harsh winters. A number of English settlers did get to the Maine coast in the 1620s, but they didn't last. They were wiped out by Native Americans and the rugged climate and other things that just wiped them out. But there is a connection with Nova Scotia. But if you look at the map today, initially it was Massachusetts here and Nova Scotia there, separated by a waterway. And there were a lot of wars that were fought in the English colonies. Now, Massachusetts was officially a southern colony, and Nova Scotia was a northern colony. Oddly enough, Nova Scotia was cut in half, and New Brunswick now, and Maine left Massachusetts and became Maine. The Nova Scotia connection. In 1605, French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in the future Canada, and the first north of Florida as Port Royal, founding what would become Acadia. Wars were common. And there were a number of reasons for wars in North America and in Europe. France and Britain were always going at it in Europe, and they decided, let's continue within the colonies. Because there was a fur trade out near the Great Lakes, a lot of fox furs and things of that nature. And if you can control that area by the Great Lakes, you're going to make a lot of money. And of course, if you're controlling that area, you might also end up with control in Europe. So there was a whole bunch of wars. So the question is, do we go with England, or do we go with France, or we let them fight their wars? French and Indian Wars. The question of Maine's ownership was a matter of continuing dispute between England and France throughout the first half of the 18th century, or the 1700s. The period was marked by a series of Indian raids on white settlements, forays, which had the active support of the French interested in seeing the English settlers being driven from the land. So the war comes across the ocean. During the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 through 1714, the British captured Port Royal, the capital of the colony, in the siege. But there was a treaty. Anybody go to Utrecht High School in Brooklyn? Well, there was a treaty there in 1713. That's why they named it, right?
I had it in the lobby.
Yeah, they had it in the lobby there. The Treaty of Utrecht, which concluded that conflict and gave the colony to Great Britain, while the Acadians were allowed to keep their lands, which were part of what was northern Massachusetts, Nova Scotia, now New Brunswick, and now Maine. And so they were able to keep their lands a little bit. This is Louisbourg, And this is outside of Sydney, Nova Scotia, in Cape Breton. And this is a replica of what was the largest fort ever built in North America at that time. And it was built by the French to protect their land in Nova Scotia. But back to the Treaty of Utrecht. Over the next 45 years, between 1713 and 1758, Acadians said, hey, we're not Brits, we're French. There is no unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. We're not doing it. And that caused a problem. Here are all the wars. King William's War, 1688 to 1697. Well, if the king can have a war, so can the queen, right? Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. Father Rail's War, 1722 to 1725. King George's War, 1744 to 1748. Father Luchair's War, 1749 to 1755, and the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, from 1756 to 1763, a war that might have very well been started by George Washington out in the Pennsylvania Territory, who got involved with the French and eventually would get captured and would be sent back to Virginia, but he may have started that war accidentally. And these are the Great Lakes. This is Sault Ste. Marie, the American side, the Canadian side over there, and they were fighting over places near Sault Ste. Marie. So the wars. King William's War was fought in the New World areas of the Great Lakes, northern New England, upper New York, Ohio Valley, and the southern frontier. The main result of this war was that the French moved down the Mississippi to New Orleans, built forts along the way. So that was that war. The Queen Anne and the George Wars dealt with the Spanish and Australian, or rather Austrian, successions to the thrones respectively. The areas of fighting there: southern frontier, Massachusetts, Quebec, St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain. In the Queen Anne's War and in George's War, the area of fighting was also in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and Nova Scotia. So what does this have to do with the Rock of Gibraltar? Anybody been to Gibraltar? Oh, they have
Use the expression.
Oh, the monkeys there. They are professional pickpockets. You got to watch out for those monkeys. I swear they share it with the police. And we don't know. The monkey pickpocket. Well, we don't know what happened to this stuff. Ask the monkey. Anyway, that is the Rock of Gibraltar. The results of the Queen Anne and the King George's War, that Britain gained possessions from France in the New World and Spain's possession of Gibraltar. Now, this is a replica of what used to be the biggest fort in the world in Louisbourg. In 1730, the French, the Acadians, built the biggest military fortress in North America, and it fell 28 years later in 1758. Louisbourg was captured by the British in 1758, demolished, and then there was the ethnic cleansing, which I'll get to in a minute. The English also got Quebec City, 1759. During the 7 Years' War, the British, under the command of the General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months, and that is looking down. In 1994-95, somewhere around there, it had to be 1994 now that I think of it, I was covering sports, and I was covering the National Hockey League player draft, which was in Quebec City, and my son was a little annoyed about something, and there was a hockey player who I knew by the name of Anders Hedberg from Sweden. I knew him when he played in New York, but he had played in Winnipeg in the World Hockey Association. And Winnipeg used to visit Quebec City 7 or 8 times a year. So they had nothing to do in the winter. So Anders Hedberg said to me, "Can I take your son somewhere?" I said, "Sure, where are you going?" He says, "We're next to the Frontenac, Chateau Frontenac." Yeah.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it still is.
Is it?
Still is, yes. And so we're walking, and he points to the Plains of Abraham. And he says, right there, he says, that's where history changed in North America. Had something gone the other way, we'd all be speaking French. And I looked at Anders and said, not you, you were born in Sweden. You'd still be speaking Swedish. Anyway, The city was defended by the French general Marquis de Montcalm. It was a very short battle. On that picture you saw where the St. Lawrence Seaway is, or the river back in those days, down here. And there's a cliff. And it's a walled city, Quebec City, except the wall ends where the cliffs are. And the French figured there's no way any English soldier is going to climb up that cliffs and get onto this farm, which is now known as the Plains of Abraham. Abraham was a farmer. And they're going to get us, so we're safe. Except the British climbed the cliffs. They got onto the Plains of Abraham, and within 15 minutes they killed Montcalm, and Quebec City ended up in the hands of the English. There's Frontenac there, and here's the Plains of Abraham, right there, and that's where the big battle was fought. The British and French had coexisted in North America, sort of, but the threat of the French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France totally from the map. They just wanted to get rid of all the French, and to be honest with you, in Nova Scotia, it was ethnic cleansing. That's what it was, ethnic cleansing. In the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, 1759, Quebec City was permanently lost by the French, and since then, the English and French have had a big problem coexisting in the province of Quebec. That's the lighthouse in Louisbourg, which is right across the way from the fort. In 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada, and the Quebec City French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestant British. Britain goes home. The war is done, but the start of the United States can be traced to Quebec's fall. How many of you remember reading Evangeline by Longfellow? Evangeline. They, in the forest primeval, all that other stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, now you.
Yes.
Well, it really is our introduction to the beginning of American history, although it is not spelled out that way. That is Evangeline. In fact, Longfellow wasn't even offered the chance to write Evangeline. Somebody else started, and the guy got bored, and he turned to Longfellow and said, hey, why don't you do this? And he did. Evangeline, a young American elementary school students are introduced to Canada by the poem. Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie, a poem written by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It was published in 1847. The poem follows an Acadian girl by the name of Evangeline and her search for her lost love, Gabriel, set during the time of what is called the expulsion of the Acadians, but the truth is it was ethnic cleansing. The expulsion of Acadians was forced removal by the British of Acadian people from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. That was all part of Acadia, and so was part of Maine, part of Acadia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana and formed American Cajun culture. They fled. Fleeing that area was very, 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 very difficult. The expulsion took place over 9 years, 1755 to 1764, during the French and Indian War. There were 1,110 Acadians in the region. 11,500 were deported. Some of them ended up in the area now known as northern Maine. Now, this is George's Island. It's in the middle of the Halifax port. And all the French that were caught were taken here. And if you got off this island, you had a chance to live. But getting off that island was very, very difficult. You probably would be dead there. During the 7-Year War, 2,000 French sailors were imprisoned on the island after the British victory in the Battle off Cape Race in Newfoundland. Fort Charlotte was one of the 4 forts where Acadians were imprisoned over 9 years of the expulsion of Acadians. According to the historian René Gilles Leblanc, there were about 1,660 Acadians held prisoner on that island in Halifax during the deportation, 600 at a time. A lot of them didn't make it. Now, if you walk on the waterfront in Halifax these days, you see all these little markings on the waterfront. And this one is basically, hey, we're sorry we practice ethnic cleansing. But you can see where some of the people ended up. The big blue streak, they ended up in the French territory of Louisiana, which Jefferson would eventually buy in 1803. Some of them went back to France. Some of them ended up in northern Maine. The expulsion, the result of the expulsion was the devastation of a primarily civilian population in the economy of the region. Thousands of Acadians died in the expulsion, many from diseases on the island. And then, if they did get onto a ship, many would drown. So it was ethnic cleansing. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763, and the English turned to the American colonies. Great Britain is not engaged in any war with anybody for the first time in 50 years. But Parliament turns to regulating the empire, especially its colonies, the 13 colonies in North America. Massachusetts and Maine are one, separated by about 10 miles in New Hampshire, where there's Hampton Beach and all that. There's about a 10-mile separation by New Hampshire. The 7 Years' War, during that time, Britain incurred an enormous debt, and we have to pay for the war. Not going to do it here. Guys like John Hancock live in the United States. He's the richest guy in the United States. And there are other rich guys who live in the United States. Why don't we tax them? That's it, we're going to tax them. The South. In those days, the South was south of Nova Scotia. That is where the South was. And then, of course, the colony was just separated by a body of water. Nova Scotia. They know England has won in Quebec. They know that the French have been chased from Nova Scotia. So what is next for the colonies, the southern colonies? Well, there's the proclamation of 1763. And I'm going to show you one thing here. Maine is up here. Quebec is down here. This is Nova Scotia over here. So Maine was in that territory, but it was only separated by a river. And when the English drew up the maps, they decided, well, you know, this is how it's going to be, except the maps were never settled properly. Parliament issues the proclamation of 1763 prohibiting settlement in the American colonies west of the Appalachians, and the Virginians are going crazy. What do you mean we can't go to past the Appalachians? Of course, that was French territory. Patrick Henry greatly resented the English. Parliament imposed the Stamp Act for taxing the American colonies, and in Virginia, Patrick Henry introduces the Stamp Act resolves in the Virginia House of Burgesses. These resolves challenge Great Britain's right to impose the tax. This is now Portland, Maine, but it was once called Falmouth. Resistance to the oppressive colonial tax provinces by the British Parliament began early in Maine, or should we say Massachusetts. In 1765, a mob seized a quantity of tax stamps at Falmouth, now Portland, and the tax on custom agents in the province became common. You thought the revolution started in 1775? There's its roots, 1765. Now that is Boston, and of course Maine was part of that. And for $10 now, you could go to this restaurant, and you can get onto one of those boats, and they'll give you some tea, and you can dump the tea, all for $10, if you so choose these days. The Tea Party, seeking to boost the troubled East India Company, British Parliament adjusted import duties. While consignees in Charleston, South Carolina, New York, and Philadelphia refused tea shipments, merchants in Boston refused to concede to Patriot pressure. That is the old South Meeting House in Boston that was undergoing renovation when I was last there 4 years ago. On the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams, before he became a beer, you know he's a beer now, right? Samuel Adams? I see one guy laughing, two guys laughing, somebody got the joke. Led but did not go on to the ships to protest. 60 members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston harbor and threw 342 chests of tea overboard. And even though you were living here and you were actually separated from Massachusetts, you were part of the Coercive Acts in 1774, which were intended to punish Massachusetts and Boston in particular for the Tea Party and the pattern of resistance it exemplified. Now, if you were living in that area, Maine and in Massachusetts, this is what the Coercive Acts did to you. Closed Boston Harbor until the lost tea was paid for in the Boston Tea Party. Ended the Massachusetts Constitution, ended free elections of town officials, moved judicial authority to Britain and British judges, basically created martial law in Massachusetts, required colonists to, hey, the British are coming, you're putting them up in your home. No, you're not. Oh, yes, you are. We are telling you, you have to put them up. And extended the freedom of worship to French-Canadian Catholics under British rule, which angered mostly the Protestant colonists. Now, that wasn't aimed really at Maine or Massachusetts. That was aimed at Quebec City and Quebec because they were all French Catholics. And the British are beginning to worry that the French Catholics in Quebec would side with the southern colonists. Well, they didn't really have to because the Quebecois hated the southern colonists more than they hated the Brits. They thought that the southern colonists, guys like Washington, and Franklin, and Jefferson, and all those other people were godless. So they didn't like the Americans, or who would become the Americans, because they thought they were all godless, hedonists, and all that other stuff. They were probably right about the forefathers, actually, when you read about them. So there's another Tea Party, one that you've never heard of, called the York Tea Party. And it takes place on September 15th, 1774. And it's in this New England backwater, of Massachusetts, but it's just another act of patriotic rebellion. The York Tea Party was not an isolated incident. There were a lot of tea parties that were taking place. Some were small, like York. Some were large, like Boston, and they were all over the place. Regardless of the size, these far-reaching protests served to demonstrate the growing resistance to English rule, which would lead to the American Revolution, and the revolution would end, for the most part, in 1781, when the Americans, with the assistance from the French, beat England in Yorktown. And there was the surrender of Cornwallis in 1781, Yorktown, Virginia, and this guy's really upset. This guy is really, really upset. King George III, he is very, very, very upset. America's lost. He's so upset that he's thinking about quitting as being the king. But then he remembers something. It's good to be the king. So he stayed. He told the bureaucrats after the Battle of Yorktown, you go get a deal done, get a deal done. Don't bother me. I'm going to be the king, but don't bother me. But he did draft a speech where he was going to quit. And the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States, and somehow Florida ended up with Spain at that time. It's not the first time that Florida changed hands. So the war is over. Welcome to the port of Portland. The revolution cost Maine dearly, about 1,000 men. The population was a little over 10,000. Lost their lives in the war, and the district's sea trade was all but destroyed, particularly in Falmouth, or Portland, because it was leveled by British bombardment, and that got the people thinking up there, can we trust the Massachusetts people to protect us up here? Can we? Well, they didn't like Boston, the State House in Boston. They just didn't like it. Following the American Revolution, frontier settlers resented being ruled from Boston and said, we've got to get away from Massachusetts. Just got to get away from it. Coastal merchants who had held the balance of political power at the time said, no, 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 we're going to stay, we're going to stay, we're going to stay. But the War of 1812 came about, and Massachusetts didn't really care about the backwater. And the people who are living there said, hey, wait a minute, they're not willing to provide adequate protection for us. We've got to get out of here. The War of 1812, which basically in history is a wasted war because everything went back to the pre-war borders. In June 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain. There were three issues: the British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. 36-year-old America is in its Middle Ages, right? Declared war for the second time against Great Britain. The plan was to conquer Canada, or the land we now know as Canada, which was called the British North America at that point, and take all of the North American part, the north of the North American part, for the United States once and for all. Never happened. Never happened. That's Albert Gallatin. He's got a statue outside of one of the outside of the White House, as a matter of fact. The Treaty of Ghent. He was the guy, Alfred Gallatin, who came up with the peace treaty. December 24th, 1814, Christmas Eve, he gets an agreement with the Brits. It's back to the 1812 borders. Britain gives up land near the American border and the Great Lakes, and the U.S. gives up land in Ontario and returns land to Spain again. The Americans would get that land for good in 1819. And James Madison signed the agreement on February 17th, 1815. But nobody told this guy that the war was over. Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory said we could take him by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and the British forces weren't informed about the end of the hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi or New Orleans. On January 18, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular U.S. victory of the war. But the problem was the war had been over for 2 months at that point. But all is not lost. All is not lost, because you might remember this guy, Johnny Horton. Because Johnny Horton had a big song in 1959 called The Battle of New Orleans. Remember the Battle of New Orleans in 1814? We took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi. He had a huge hit, so all was not lost. Well, it's time for statehood. The war is over, and the people who would eventually form Maine are upset with Massachusetts. So delegates met for 3 weeks in October 1819 in the capital, now named Portland, to hammer out a state constitution, a document strongly rooted in political independence, religious freedom, and popular control of the government. The president of the convention was William King, a prominent Bath, Maine, or Massachusetts merchant, and a shipbuilder who subsequently became Maine's first governor. And here we go. That is the statue of Portland, right in the middle of downtown Portland. Statehood. The popular sentiment was, let's become a state. And the separation movement went forward. Congress established Maine as the 23rd state under the Missouri Compromise. And what happened is Maine enters as an anti-slavery state. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but Portland was a big area for the Underground Railroad. The Portland Freedom Trail, and it talks about in these plaques about the Underground Railroad coming through Portland, getting into Portland, and then getting into what was the province of Nova Scotia, which was fighting its own battle to break away from Britain around this time. But it's an anti-slavery state, comes in as a free state under the provisions of the Missouri Compromise. And it has a strong anti-slavery tradition. Maine's organized anti-slavery efforts began in 1833, the formation of the first Maine Anti-Slavery Society. And here's another plaque, secondhand clothing of Lloyd Scott, 44 Exchange Street. Scott became the vice president of the Portland Union Anti-Slavery Society in 1842. Coming up to Maine, You need secondhand clothes to go to wherever you want, which is probably, you could stay, you could end up in Nova Scotia, you could end up in Ontario. Actually, there is a place off of 81 in New York as you travel to the Canadian border that also was a big, big Underground Railroad stop. Maine played an important role in one of the most important movements for African Americans seeking freedom from slavery, the Underground Railroad. From Portland to Brunswick, Topsham to Brewer to Fort Kent, sympathetic whites and freed blacks created some 75 safe houses along the route. They risked their own lives to provide a hiding place in homes or businesses for escaping slaves. Many of them were heading up to British North America or Canada. The Abyssinian Meeting House in Portland became a safe haven for runaway slaves, and they found sympathetic support from both blacks and whites. It served as a conduit in shielding runaway slaves from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That required that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. How many of you read Uncle Tom's Cabin? It was written in Maine.
I know.
It was written in Maine. Encouraged by her sister-in-law, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the wife of a Bodine college professor, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in Brunswick. First published as a series in 1851. Its first appeared as a book the following year. It's the heart-wrenching tale that portrays slave families forced to cope with separation by their masters through sales. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in the North. Oh, you know how books are being banned left and right now? You know, the Bible last week was banned in Utah. A school district in Utah banned the Bible. Do you believe that? They banned the Bible because they said that it had a lot of sex and violence in it. So the Bible's been taken off bookshelves in the school district in Utah. Diary of Anne Frank has been taken off the school bookshelves in the school of Vero Beach, Florida, and also in Texas. So this book was banned in the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin was adapted for theater multiple times, beginning in 1852. The novel made use of themes and techniques of theatrical melodrama. Popular at the time, its transition to the stage was rather easy, and here is Stowe. When the author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, visited Abe Lincoln at the White House in December 1862, Lincoln reportedly greeted her by saying, "Is this the little woman who made the Great War?" The publication of the novel was, of course, one of many events in the decade of the 1850s that put the country on the road to the Civil War. Now, you ask Canadians who won the War of 1812, they will say, "We did." You ask Americans, they'll say, "What was the War of 1812?" Well, the justification by the Canadians, even though Canada wasn't a country until 1867, it wasn't a country until 1867, so that question is irrelevant. But the justification is, well, the Americans never invaded us again. Well, that is true, but it almost didn't happen. Britain against America, number 3. That's my wife in front of the St. John, thank you. St. John, New Brunswick City Hall. Anyway, there was in 1839 a boundary dispute. Can you imagine a border dispute? 1839. The precise boundary between Maine, the new state of Maine, and New Brunswick, a new province in Canada, well actually a new colony in Canada, because the Brits had to send the Tories that lived in the United States after the war somewhere, and they carved up Nova Scotia and they formed New Brunswick. Anyway, it remained a matter of often heated arguments for years and years and years after the Revolutionary War. And finally in 1839, it's about ready to break into full-scale action. The Maine legislature that year raised funds to support a military force of 10,000 to protect the state's border claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched from the scene from Quebec. At this point, the U.S. Congress enters the picture. War? Why not? They gave $10 million, and they sent soldiers should a war break out. And nearly 50,000 troops were ready for action, and the Major General Winfield Scott was dispatched to the scene. But Scott managed to work out a temporary agreement between the two parties before the so-called War of Aroostook reached the point of bloodshed. Many of you know that the Americans and the British almost faced off for a third time. But in 1842, Daniel Webster, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, negotiated by Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State, settled a long-time feud with England, where Maine ended up and the British-ruled Canada began. War had narrowly been avoided between the two nations on several occasions over the border and incursion issues. The treaty was instrumental in bettering diplomatic relations. It was a temporary solution. The border disputes were settled in 1846, and my next talk next month, From Sea to Shining Sea, I talk about the border disputes and the definitive border between Britain and the United States, and Britain and Canada, is decided in 1846. Now, there was such a thing called the Maine Law, and that guy has got a lobster. That's a statue of a guy and a lobster right there in Bahaba.
I saw it.
Yeah, the temperance movement had its origins in Maine. The world's first total abstinence society was formed in Portland in 1815. A state organization of temperance societies was formed in 1834, and within a dozen years had developed enough political clout to force the enactment of a state law prohibiting the sale of alcoholic spirits except for medicinal and mechanical purposes. Mechanical purposes? What are you putting? Liquor into a tractor or a steamboat? Anyway, they didn't address if the liquor was smuggled in from the New Brunswick border, which probably happened. Portland's Neil Dowd, known internationally as the father of Prohibition, led the way, and Maine approved a total ban on the manufacture and sale of liquor in 1851. And of course, Prohibition would catch on in the United States by 1919. And this bar in Boston always cracked me up. It's called Carrie Nation. She was one of the biggest prohibitionists ever. And yet there's a bar called Carrie Nation in Boston, and it features Boston's original speakeasy. And it's right down the street from the State House. So you know Massachusetts politicians, before they went home, probably visited the original speakeasy in Boston. On January 19, 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. With the Great Depression by 1932, Franklin Roosevelt ran for president on a platform calling for Prohibition's repeal. He easily defeated the incumbent, Herbert Hoover. February 1933, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th. The amendment was submitted to the states in December 1933, and Utah of all places, said yes. It was the 36th and final state necessary needed for ratification. The Maine law remained in effect in one form or another until the repeal of the national prohibition in 1934. And there is Maine. Taking a look, that also is Bar Harbor. Once Maine became a separate state, there was a period of tremendous economic growth in which a number of important mining and manufacturing industries emerged. In addition to lumbering, and they get the lumberjacks from Quebec. In 1994, that was a big problem because of seasonal visas, and nobody in Maine wanted to do the lumberjack thing, and actually the seasonal visas impacted baseball. And baseball, along with Maine, lobbied to get them to change the seasonal visas. Baseball wanted it because they had all of the Caribbean players they wanted to bring into the United States, and Maine needed lumberjacks. So baseball and the Maine lumberjack industry changed seasonal visas in the United States. Anyway, in addition to lumbering, the traditional fishing and shipbuilding pursuits enter the boom period. Ice harvesting, granite and lime quarry also developed as important industries, and it became a summer playground for the rich. Now, there is one very famous sports event featuring one very famous person. The famous or infamous Maine sports event was Cassius Clay, or Muhammad Ali at that point, knocking out Sonny Liston in Lewiston, Maine. Lewiston, Maine? To hold a big fight? It was supposed to be in Boston, but it ended up in Lewiston, Maine, which is outside of Portland. It was a rematch between Muhammad Ali and the former champ Sonny the Bear Liston. It was May 25th, 1965, and was expected to put Lewiston on the map. Never did. The fight had originally been scheduled for Boston on May 25th, but a local prosecutor said the city didn't have a proper license for the fight, and the bout was moved to Lewiston. Decades later, the fight was still described locally as a fiasco or debacle. Ali won the fight, and this is me and Ali in 1985. Couldn't speak to him at this point. The Parkinson's kicked in, and he just spoke above a whisper. But why was it infamous? Well, how many of you remember Robert Goulet? How many liked Robert Goulet, the singer? Well, his mother was born in Lewiston, Maine. And he started off with the national anthem and couldn't remember the words after the first 5 words, or after "Oh Say Can You Sing." Couldn't remember by the dawn's early light. Then the fight, nearly a minute and 40, at nearly the 1 minute 40-second mark, Liston threw a lazy left jab. Ali appeared to be backing up, countered with a short chopping right. Liston went down. Was it a phantom punch that put Liston down? Was the fight fixed? Well, whatever it was, Ali won the rematch at Lewiston for a few days, was on the map. Now, your tax dollars at work. This is your tax dollars at work. I was sent by the State Department in 2007 to speak at the George Bush Presidential Library. You can say, what does this have to do with me? I'll tell you in a minute. I had to speak to 20 college students about the politics of sports business and how sports business operates in the United States. There were 3 Nigerians, 3 Turks, 3 Russians, 3 Venezuelans, 3 Indonesians, 1 Canadian who didn't know why he was there, and 4 Americans. And he was kind of an American anyway at heart. Anyway, so your tax dollars at work, I had to give 2 talks, both on the same day, about 2 hours apart. And there I am at the Bush Library, and that was probably the highlight of my speaking career, speaking as part of a State Department job, which you paid for, at the Bush Library before, I would say, 15 kids from 5 nations that were kind of hostile to America. But anyway, Kennebunkport and the Bush Compound. Bush Compound was the summer home of the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. It's located on Walker's Point. Walker's Point, by the way, Walker's Point, one of his middle names is Walker, juts out into the Atlantic Ocean in southern Maine in the town of Kennebunkport. The property has been in a family retreat for more than a century. Prescott Bush, the senator from Connecticut, he was there as well. And again, thank you, Mr. President. It was George W. Bush and Robert Gates. It was Texas A&M. Robert Gates, who became the Secretary of Defense, and Condoleezza Rice. They were the 3 who ended up, well, they probably didn't, but my application had to be cleared by the White House, by the State Department, and Texas A&M. So thank you, Mr. President, and there's our motley crew. Believe it or not, that is the Bush Library, and instead of an auditorium, they had to sit at school desks listening to me. We did have a talk at Texas A&M where there was an auditorium. The Bush Compound. While Bush was the Vice President of the U.S. between 1981 and 1981 and 1989, and President between 1989 and 1993, there were a whole bunch of guests in Kennebunkport, including Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, John Major, the also the British Prime Minister. Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the Russian Presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and Vladimir Putin, and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy. And this is Bar Harbor. Bar Harbor, the playground of the rich, or the not so rich who take the cruise ships and go there and spend no money in Bar Harbor but walk around. By 1890, there were 30 hotels, including the Miramonte Inn, a historic landmark that would later survive a massive fire in 1947. Tourists arriving by train and ferry to the Gilded Age Resort which rivaled Newport, Rhode Island. The rich and famous tried to outdo one another with entertainment in the States, often hiring landscape gardener and landscape architect Beatrice Ferrin, who was a resident of Reed Point Estate, to design their gardens. A glimpse of their lifestyle was available from the shore path. That's the path on the shore that you could walk for about a mile. And you looked at the waterfront lawns, yachting, garden parties at the Pot and Kettle Club, carriage rides up Cadillac Mountain were popular diversions. There are the people who designed this park also designed the Rockefeller Preserve, which is in Westchester, and they look rather alike. Others enjoyed horse racing at the Robin Hood Park, Morrell Park. President William Howard Taft played golf in 1910 at the Kibo Valley Golf Club. And there it is, Acadia National Park. Became a national park in 1919 under the Woodrow Wilson administration. John D. Rockefeller was responsible for the design of the park. John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil Company, donated about a third of the land, 11,000 acres in the park. He built the carriage roads that are now used for hiking and biking. J.P. Morgan owned a house that's adjacent to Bar Harbor. Cornelius Vanderbilt built cottages at Bar Harbor. The Astor family owned hotels and cottages in Bar Harbor and surrounding areas. And that was a cold, cold day on top of Cadillac Mountain in October. One of the most unique historical aspects of how Acadia National Park formed is due to the vision of and donations of private citizens like George P. Dorr and Charles W. Eliot, same guy who was the head of Princeton, who anticipated the dangers that overdevelopment would bring and acted quickly to develop it. That's Thunder Hole. You walk by there and you hear boom, 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 Thunder Hole. It's one of the smallest parks in the United States. It offers mountain, sea, and lake vistas and craggy cliffs that plunge to the surf, and it's got about 125 miles of trails for hiking and biking. And there is the Cadillac Mountain, which is 1,532 feet, and that Thunder Hole water spout. That is downtown Bar Harbor. And you can't get there on a cruise ship. You have to take a tender to get to where my wife is standing at that point. And you could go and spend hundreds of dollars for a tour with a cruise ship, or you could spend $1.50 and take a trolley around town. It's up to you. I shouldn't be saying that, but I haven't been on a cruise ship in 4 years. In mid-October 1947, Maine experienced a severe drought. Sparks at a cranberry bog near Town Hill ignited a wildfire that would intensify over 10 days and would not be declared out until November. Can you imagine what it smelled like after what we've gone through the last couple of days? It was one of several wildfires in the state that year. Nearly half the eastern side of the Mount Desert Island burned, including 67 palatial homes on Millionaires Row. 5 historic grand hotels, 170 permanent homes were destroyed. Over 10,000 acres of Acadia National Park destroyed, but the town's business district was spared, including Mount Desert Street, where several of the former summer homes within a historic district listed on the National Register of Historic Places operates today as an inn. And there is Bar Harbor. When you get over to the tender ship, and there's a whale. Well, it's supposed to be a whale anyway. Bar Harbor remains this year, but won't be there next year, remains a popular port for cruise ships through the fall. And usually it's a stop for me going up there when I'm on the speaking engagements there. But visitors from a number of cruise ships, the number regularly surpassed the number of people who actually live in the town, which is about 2,000, and that's a problem. An ordinance passed in November 2021 that restricted the number of daily visitors from cruise ships to 1,000 a day. Starting in 2024, the maximum limit of guests per day will be 1,000 and will be fully implemented. The cruise ship industry, as you might imagine, is going absolutely crazy. But here's the deal with cruise ships, and I can tell you this. People on cruise ships don't drop money in town. Yeah, you got to pay. Well, I don't even know if they pay. Well, they got to pay for the tender. But you pay your port fees. And the people go into town, they wander around, they might buy a snow globe, they might buy one of those magnets. You were there. And if you're in the end of the season in Bar Harbor, you might buy a sweatshirt, you might buy sweatpants, but you don't spend money. I mean, when I talk about money, cruise ship passengers may spend 20 bucks every port they go to. Every port they go to. Because why would you want a dinner? And first of all, you can't even eat a dinner because you're out by 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in a lot of ports. So what are you spending money on? You're basically walking around the town. Or you walk up to Cadillac Mountain, and for $1.50 you take a bus and you can get there. I understand what they're talking about. We don't want cruise ships. Crowds our town. We don't need the cruise ships. They don't spend money. So, and that's happening in Venice, Italy too, but that's for a different reason because of water levels and all that. There are a lot of places that are thinking, we don't want 10,000 people here for an 8-hour period. We don't spend any money. Anyway, so we say goodbye to Maine and Bar Harbor, and we sail off to wherever we're sailing off, and that is Bar Harbor, filled with pleasure crafts and little stores and everything else. So thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, other than the rich and famous that live all over the coast of Maine and have these superb villas and places for summer entertainment, what do the plain, ordinary folks do more in the interior? What does Maine have?
Try to keep warm.
Well, that's not the only industry.
Yeah, well, LL Bean is there. You know, there's some, you know, the forestry industry is big. But, you know, they're trying to keep people there. They're trying to figure out, and Portland's now a foodie town. Portland wanted to attract yuppies. They're trying to build up, but there's not much there. Most of it's forest.
My husband played golf at the Balsams in Dixville Notch.
Oh, okay.
And when I was there was so few, first of all, they didn't have one Jew.
Yeah.
We had to tell them who recommended us.
Okay.
And who recommended them to them in order to go there.
I mean,
But it was good.
It's.
I had to pick a place to die.
It's, basically it's tourism,
They did
timber
not want
industry.
Jewish people.
Yeah, tourism, tourist industry. It's not really that much out there. It's cold. It's cold most of the time.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So. Anybody else?
Don't they used to say, as Maine goes, so goes the nation?
Yes.
I know my history.
Maine is very important in my life because my husband went to Bowdoin College
Oh, okay.
in Brunswick, Maine, and Norman. I come from a very waspy family, very waspy.
And he was Jewish.
And he was Jewish, but I always loved the other. And Norman, both of us had very tall mothers and very short fathers. But Norman's father was only 5 feet tall and was in vaudeville. But the reason I wanted to come down and hear your speech is because I wanted to hear what you had to say about Maine.
Yeah.
And I went up there a lot because Norman and I were married for 60 years, and it took him a long time to get through college because he had a lot of sort of medical and emotional problems. And so I did go to Maine a lot, and I saw the people there, and I really loved the state. And I never went there as a rich person enjoying Maine, but I went there as a wife, you know, trying to help.
Your
my-
father, who did the Kennedy debate, must have been up there.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, and you know, covering politics and all
Right,
that.
right.
Somebody back there, yes?
Yeah, this is actually about Quebec City.
Yeah.
I know it's a walled city, I've been
Yeah.
there. Was it built by the British or the
French.
French?
French, the French. There was something about building walls. Mackinac Island in Michigan. The Americans didn't do a full job around the fort, and the British got them from behind in the War of
We
1812.
stayed at the Chateau Frontenac.
Frontenac is nice. Is that it? Well, we will see you next month, and we will be talking about James K. Polk and how James K. Polk was the guy who created the modern United